A woman vanished from a rest stop on a highway in rural Montana, leaving behind a car with a full tank of gas and a phone still charging on the passenger seat. By the second year, her family had exhausted every lead law enforcement could chase. By the fifth year, the case had been formally reclassified as presumed death, a quiet administrative decision that closed the file without ever closing the wound. By the seventh year, a judge signed the paperwork, making it legal, official, final. 3 days later, she knocked on her sister's front door. And the man who'd spent those 7 years comforting that same sister, attending every vigil, helping plan the funeral nobody had a body for, was the reason she'd been gone at all. This is Larkspur County, Montana, May 2017. Dana Whitfield was 31, a wildlife biologist who'd taken a temporary research posting tracking elk migration patterns through the eastern stretch of the county, the kind of job that meant long solo drives and even longer stretches without cell service. Conditions everyone who knew her said made her disappearance feel almost plausible in the worst way, like the wilderness had simply done what wilderness sometimes does. She'd chosen the field specifically because she preferred the company of open country to crowded rooms, a trait her sister used to tease her about relentlessly, joking that Dana would rather track an elk herd for 6 hours than sit through a single dinner party. Her sister, Renee Whitfield, was 2 years younger, the more grounded of the two, married with a young son, the kind of sister who called every Sunday whether Dana picked up or not, a ritual the two of them had kept since college regardless of time zones or remote postings. Renee was the one who reported Dana missing when 4 Sundays passed without an answer. 4 unanswered calls that, taken individually, meant nothing, but taken together, felt like a held breath that wouldn't release. May 14th, 2017, a Sunday. Dana had texted Renee that morning saying she was finishing a research loop and would call that evening once she reached cell signal again. A normal enough message given the nature of her work, one of dozens of similar texts she'd sent over the prior months that had never once raised concern. She was last seen on gas station surveillance footage at a small rest stop on Route 87 at 2:14 p.m., buying coffee and a granola bar, chatting briefly with the attendant about the weather. A conversation the attendant would later recall to investigators almost word for word, struck by how ordinary the entire exchange had felt at the time. She paid in cash, declined a receipt, and walked back toward her car. That was the last confirmed sighting of Dana Whitfield for what would become 7 years. Her car was found 2 days later, parked neatly in the rest stop's gravel lot, exactly where the surveillance footage showed her walking toward it, the tank nearly full. Her phone still plugged into the charger, dead, her field notebook and research equipment untouched on the back seat, a half-finished crossword puzzle resting on the dashboard where she'd apparently left it during a break days earlier. There was no sign of struggle, no blood, nothing disturbed. It looked, investigators said at the time, as though she had simply walked away from her own life, mid-sentence. The Larkspur County Sheriff's Department, working alongside state troopers given the rural, sparsely populated terrain, conducted an extensive search across the surrounding 40 square miles of wilderness, the kind of search that in a place like eastern Montana means horseback units, search dogs, and small aircraft sweeping terrain too rugged for vehicles. Lead investigator Sergeant Will Okonkwo said early in the search that the case presented a particular kind of difficulty rarely discussed outside law enforcement circles. When someone vanishes from a city, you've got cameras, transactions, a digital trail a mile wide. Out here, a person can step off a trail, and the wilderness just absorbs them. We had over 40 square miles and almost nothing pointing us toward any specific direction within it. On day 9, a hiker reported finding a torn strip of fabric snagged on brush nearly 11 miles from the rest stop, and search teams spent 3 days combing that section of terrain before lab analysis confirmed the fabric had no connection to Dana, a remnant from an entirely unrelated backpacking trip months earlier, A trucker called in a sighting of a woman matching Dana's description at a diner 2 states away. It went nowhere. The woman in question located and cleared within days. One of the most consistent presences throughout the search and the years that followed was Marcus Tillery, 34, a family friend who had known both sisters since childhood, close enough to Renee's family that he was practically considered an uncle to her young son. Tillery worked as a contractor doing seasonal maintenance for several state park properties, giving him an intimate professional knowledge of the very wilderness terrain the search teams were combing, a familiarity colleagues described as encyclopedic, the kind that came from decades of working access roads and remote parcels most contractors never bothered learning in that kind of detail. He showed up to every search briefing, organized volunteer search parties on his own initiative, and became, over the following months, one of Renee's primary sources of emotional support as the case stretched from weeks into months with no resolution. He took her son fishing on weekends when Renee was too exhausted from organizing search logistics to manage it herself, the kind of small, consistent kindness that made him, in Renee's own later words, feel like family long before any of this began. By the end of the first year, the search had been scaled back to a periodic review status, the kind of quiet deprioritization that happens to nearly every wilderness disappearance once the most likely search radius has been exhausted without result. Renee, increasingly desperate, organized her own volunteer efforts for years afterward, annual search weekends that drew dwindling numbers of participants each time. Tillery presented every single one, always among the first to arrive and the last to leave, often the one who drove the search vehicle that carried the volunteer roster, the same roster he himself signed every year. On the 3rd anniversary, Renee gave a brief interview to a regional paper, describing the particular cruelty of not knowing, how grief without a body felt less like mourning and more like an unfinished sentence she had to keep reading over and over. Tillery sat beside her during that interview, occasionally placing a hand on her shoulder when her voice caught an image the paper ran alongside the article. The two of them framed together as the picture of a community's unwavering devotion to finding one of its own. By the 5th year, with no remains recovered and no new evidence surfacing, Renee made the difficult decision, on the advice of both law enforcement and a grief counselor, to petition the county for a legal declaration of presumed death, a process that allowed the family to finally settle Dana's estate and, in Renee's words at the time, stop living in a place that's neither grief nor hope, just waiting. Tillery was the one who drove her to the courthouse to file the initial paperwork, waiting in the parking lot for nearly 2 hours while she sat inside completing forms that reduced 7 years of unanswered Sunday calls into a series of legal checkboxes. The petition took nearly 2 years to fully process through the county court system. Delayed twice by procedural requirements neither sister fully understood, each delay reopening a wound Renee had hoped by then might finally be closing. Tillery was present in the courtroom on May 9th, 2024, sitting directly behind Renee, when the judge signed the order formally declaring Dana Whitfield legally deceased, 7 years almost to the week after she vanished from that rest stop. 3 days later, on May 12th, 2024, Renee answered her own front door expecting a delivery, a small package she'd been tracking all week, to find her sister standing on the porch instead, thinner than she remembered, her hair longer and gray, streaked in a way 7 years shouldn't fully explain, wearing clothes that didn't belong to any era Renee could place, but unmistakably, impossibly, Dana. Renee's first reaction, by her own later account, wasn't joy. It was a kind of disorienting terror, the sensation of a math problem refusing to balance no matter how many times she ran the numbers. She said later she stood in the doorway for several seconds before her body would let her move at all, her son's voice calling out from somewhere inside the house, asking who was at the door, the question hanging unanswered in the air between the two sisters for what felt, to Renee, like several full minutes rather than the few seconds it actually was. Dana was taken immediately to the county hospital for evaluation, malnourished, showing signs of long-term physical confinement consistent with restricted movement and limited sunlight exposure, but otherwise alive in a way that defied every assumption the case had settled into over 7 years. When she was finally able to speak with investigators at length, the account she gave reoriented the entire case around a name nobody had ever once flagged as a person of interest. According to Dana, she had been approached at the rest stop that day by someone she recognized, someone whose presence felt safe enough that she didn't think twice about accepting a ride when he mentioned car trouble down the road, and asked if she wouldn't mind looking at it, given that she'd mentioned once in passing months earlier that she used to help her father work on engines growing up. She remembered very little about what happened next beyond a sharp chemical smell, and then waking up disoriented in a windowless structure she would later be able to describe only as cold, concrete, and isolated. Somewhere, she estimated, based on subtle environmental cues over the years, the angle of light through a single narrow vent, the particular quality of distant sound during certain weather, to be on undeveloped land within the same general wilderness region the original search had covered. For 7 years, she said, she had been kept in that structure, fed irregularly, allowed almost no light, and visited periodically by a man she described in painstaking detail to a forensic sketch artist, details that, once cross-referenced against years of search volunteer rosters and family friend photographs, matched Marcus Tillery with a precision that left Sergeant Okonkwo, by his own admission, physically shaken when the comparison was first laid out for him. She told investigators that during those visits, conversation was sparse and one-sided, the man speaking to her at length about Renee, about her nephew growing up, details that, she realized only in retrospect, he could only have known from continuing to spend time with her family the entire time she was missing. Dana told investigators she had finally escaped 3 days before showing up at Renee's door after a section of aging structure gave way during a storm, allowing her, after years of memorizing what little she could observe of her surroundings during brief supervised moments outside, to navigate on foot back toward terrain she recognized from her old research routes. Investigators moved on Tillery within hours of Dana's account being recorded. He was located at his own home, arrested without incident, and according to deputies present, said almost nothing during the initial encounter beyond a single sentence, delivered, they said, with an unsettling flatness, his expression barely changing as the cuffs went on. I never thought she'd actually find her way back. He was transported to the county detention facility and placed in an interrogation room where investigators began laying out, piece by piece, what 7 years of searching the wrong terrain and trusting the wrong friend had finally, impossibly, come undone by. For the first full day, Tillery said almost nothing beyond requesting an attorney. His composure remarked upon by multiple deputies as unnervingly steady given the circumstances, the same steady, helpful demeanor he'd brought to every search briefing for 7 years now turned, in that small interview room, toward simply waiting out the silence. It wasn't until forensic teams, working from Dana's environmental descriptions and her own surviving knowledge of regional terrain, located a remote structure on an undeveloped parcel of land Tillery had quietly purchased under a shell entity 6 months before Dana's disappearance, that his composure finally broke during a second round of questioning. Faced with property records, construction permit filings for what had been described to the county as a personal storage structure, and Dana's own detailed corroborating account of the building's interior layout, right down to the specific placement of a narrow ventilation gap she'd spent years memorizing, he began to talk. According to his eventual confession, Tillery had harbored an obsessive fixation on Dana for years prior to her disappearance, one he'd never acted on or disclosed to anyone, including, he claimed, fully to himself, until an encounter at a family gathering months before her disappearance left him, in his words, unable to stop thinking about her in a way I knew wasn't right. He told investigators he had tracked her research schedule for weeks, learned her rest stop routine, and purchased the remote parcel specifically with the intention of constructing somewhere to keep her. A plan, he insisted, almost desperately, according to the lead detective present, he had never intended to be permanent. I just wanted her to need me, he said at one point in his recorded confession, a line the lead prosecutor would later read aloud to the jury with a long pause built in afterward, letting the sentence sit in the room exactly as long as it needed to. What made the case almost unbearable for investigators to fully process was what came next in his account. Knowing Dana was missing and the entire community, including Renee, was searching for her, Tillery had inserted himself into the search efforts not out of any calculated cover, he claimed, but because, in his words, staying close to Renee felt like the only way to stay close to what remained of Dana at all. He attended every search weekend. He comforted Renee through years of unresolved grief. He sat in the courtroom holding her hand the day a judge declared her sister legally dead, 3 days before that same sister, kept alive the entire time roughly 19 miles from where they sat, found her own way home. Marcus Tillery was charged with kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment, and a series of related charges spanning the full 7-year period of Dana's captivity. The trial, held in early 2025, drew intense regional and eventually national coverage, driven almost entirely by the detail that seemed to unsettle even seasoned crime reporters most, the years of proximity. The volunteer search efforts, the courtroom hand-holding on the very day the case was formally legally closed. Dana testified for 2 full days, describing the physical and psychological reality of 7 years in confinement with a measured precision that several jurors later said was harder to sit through than if she had broken down entirely her account, delivered in the same careful, methodical tone. Colleagues said she once used to log field observations during her research career, as though some part of her had survived captivity by treating her own ordeal as data to be recorded rather than simply endured. Renee testified as well, her account of answering the door 3 days after the death declaration, drawing audible reactions from the courtroom gallery despite the judge's repeated requests for silence. Sergeant Okonkwo testified at length about the Shell entity property records and the years of search logistics Tillery had personally organized, walking the jury through volunteer rosters bearing Tillery's own signature dated to weekends that, according to the prosecution's timeline, fell during periods Dana later confirmed she had been actively held less than 20 miles away. The defense argued for diminished culpability based on what they described as Tillery's documented psychological fixation, a strategy that gained no real traction once the prosecution walked the jury through 7 years of premeditated, sustained logistical effort, the Shell entity property purchase, the irregular feeding schedule, the years of calculated proximity to the victim's own family. In her closing argument, the lead prosecutor told the jury that the case's defining horror wasn't contained in any single act, but in its sustained ordinariness, 7 years of search weekends and Sunday dinners and a hand on a grieving sister's shoulder, every single one of those gestures performed by a man who could have ended the search at any moment and chose instead to keep attending it. The jury deliberated for just under 5 hours before returning guilty verdicts on every count. Before sentencing, Dana was given the opportunity to address the court. She stood, looked directly at Tillery for the first time during the entire trial, and said only, "You used to ask me, every visit, if I'd forgiven you yet. I want you to know the answer was always no, the whole time, even when I was too afraid to say it out loud." Tillery was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms, a sentence the judge, reading from the bench, described as reflecting not a single act of violence, but 7 years of sustained, deliberate cruelty disguised every single day as friendship. Outside the courthouse, Renee Whitfield spoke briefly to reporters. her sister standing beside her for the first public appearance either had given since Dana's return. He held my hand at her funeral. Renee said, "There was no body in that casket because there was no body to bury." The whole time he knew exactly why. She declined further questions, and the two sisters left together. An image that ran in nearly every regional and several national outlets covering the verdict. Renee's son, who had grown from a toddler into a teenager over the 7 years his aunt was missing, was present in the courtroom for the verdict, and later told a family friend, in the only comment he's made publicly on the case, that he still couldn't fully reconcile the man who taught him to fish with the man the jury had just convicted, a sentence he said out loud once and has reportedly declined to discuss since. Dana's recovery has been slow and, by her own account, ongoing in ways she expects will never fully resolve. She has not returned to fieldwork, citing both the physical toll of 7 years of confinement and a complicated relationship with the same wilderness terrain that once defined her career and later defined her captivity, terrain she now sees, when she sees it at all, only through a car window. In her only extended interview since the trial, she was asked what she thought about most from those 7 years. She didn't describe the structure or the isolation or even Tillery himself. "I think about the search parties," she said. "I think about how close some of those volunteer search weekends probably got without anyone ever knowing, and how the person organizing them was the only one who actually knew how close they were." She paused for a long moment before adding one further detail she said she'd never spoken publicly before, that on certain still nights in the structure, she had been able to hear faintly what she now believes were search dogs barking somewhere in the distance, sometime during that first desperate year, a sound she said she has never been able to fully explain to anyone, including herself, without it undoing something in her chest all over again. The Larkspur County Sheriff's Department has since revised its protocols for presumed death petitions in long-term missing persons cases, now requiring an independent case review specifically examining any individual who maintained sustained voluntary proximity to the investigation or the victim's family throughout its duration. A policy now informally referred to within the department, without irony, as the Whitfield Protocol. The state's broader Missing Persons Task Force has since cited the case in training materials distributed to rural departments across 3 states, an acknowledgement that the very qualities that once made Tillery seem like a model volunteer, his consistency, his local knowledge, his emotional availability to a grieving family, were the same qualities that let him operate undetected for 7 full years. Sergeant Okonkwo, who led the original search and later the reopened investigation, has said in training sessions since that the case fundamentally changed how he evaluates a search effort's most consistent, dedicated volunteers. "We're trained to look at people who avoid the search," he said. "Nobody trains you to look twice at the person who shows up to every single one. Dana Whitfield is alive today, living quietly outside the county where she once vanished, in regular contact with her sister, slowly rebuilding a life around the 7 years that were taken from it. The legal declaration of her death, formally signed and filed 3 days before she walked back into her own life, remains on record in Larkspur County's court archives, a strange bureaucratic footnote to a story that refused, in the most literal sense possible, to stay closed. If you made it to the end, thank you for staying. This story is built from public investigative procedure, forensic methodology, and courtroom testimony patterns documented in real long-term captivity cases. Reconstructed here as a composite case. Cases like this exist far more often than people realize, where the person standing closest through every search weekend, every vigil, every grieving phone call, is the only one who ever knew there was nothing left to search for. What part of this stayed with you the longest? Tell me in the comments. I read every one. And if these are the cases that follow you out of the room, subscribe, because there are more of them out there, closer than anyone wants to believe.